Hello friends, I made this for. My name is Lauren and today I'm going to be talking to you about tarot and astrology and not so much how they're directly tied together right now, but how we can use a very important card in tarot to help us ground into release as we're getting into eclipse season. So eclipses can be pretty wild, right? We usually look at eclipses as a 6-month cycle, sometimes 18 months, depending on the themes that come up for you around this time. What might come up for you, of course, is going to be different than what might come up for me. So today I'm going to talk about the Ten of Swords, a card I think is really misunderstood, also a card that I think has a lot of medicine in it, and how we can use that medicine of the tarot to relate back to what we are doing astrologically in the world. So, of course, everything I say is always my opinion. And of course, what might come up for me might not be what's coming up for you because astrology affects all of us so differently. So it's important to keep that in mind as I'm talking about Ten of Swords and talking about the astrology around November 30th, which is a full moon in Gemini. It's going to look very different for you. But I digress. I have a video coming out next week that is about the astrology around, or well, it's not even about the astrology, it's a tarot reading around that full moon later this month. Make sure to stick around to check that out. But first, let's talk about the Ten of Swords and what that can mean for you. So, as always, I'm going to be talking about the Ten of Swords through different decks. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at the Smith-Waite, the Holly Simple Tarot, and I think the first card actually for today, the 8th House Tarot. So, as you can see from this version of the Ten of Swords, it says Sun in Gemini, which I think is pretty interesting because I didn't actually make that connection when I wanted to make this video, that this card is representative or reflective of the Sun in Gemini. It's really something I didn't even think about, but really interesting because I feel like a lot of Ten of Swords energy is coming up around the full moon later this month, which again is in Gemini. But as we can see from this version of this card, this is about death. It's a mini death card. We see the setting sun, we see the skulls. That is all really relative, or relates back to some of the classic imagery of this card. And of course, this card is known as a mini death, so this makes sense that the artist decided to go with this for this card. Now, relating it back to Gemini, well, as I've said before, swords relate to air. Air relates to mental space. So we do see that air is represented in this card with the Sun in Gemini. But why does air relate back to mental capacities or thoughts, right? So that can be kind of confusing if you're not really into astrology or tarot necessarily, if you're a little new to both things. Hi, how are you? Welcome. These are areas that we can kind of like connect with different elements, right? When we talk about the element of earth or any of the pentacles, that relates to a certain physicality, something in the physical world. It doesn't have to necessarily mean money, but physical interaction rather, or even home, job, things like that, things that are measurable outside of ourselves. When we talk about fire and the wands, that's creativity. When we talk about cups or water, that's emotions. So if that element doesn't really relate to you, you don't feel like that makes sense, then of course you can interpret this differently. But when I'm looking at swords in that suit, I'm usually connecting it back to where is my mental space. So this morning, for example, I pulled the Page of Swords. So I'm dealing with a lot on my mind and trying to unpack it in a place where I can relate to my thoughts and feelings in my mental capacities as a fresh start rather than living in the fear or worry that has been kind of following me after the election. But I digress. That's one way that I've decided to integrate the lessons of the swords. And of course, you should always think for yourself when it comes to tarot. If something relates to you in a way that feels different, listen to that, because you are here to interpret it in your way. Now, with that said, mini death, right? Why is it a mini death? Well, because this is the classic imagery for this card. And of course, this is not the most comforting thing to see in all of your life, right? But another thing to think about is when we're looking at tens in the minors, we're looking at a completion, or we're kind of reaching the end of a certain cycle, right? The tens is kind of the end of this part of the suit. Now we can look at the kings and queens as either coming before or after. I personally don't see them in that sort of relationship with the tens or with any suit, actually. I think they're kind of their own thing. But if that's how you feel this works for this card, of course, more power to you. The Tens of Swords is really fascinating though, right? Because ultimately this 10 has a lot to do with something striking us down and reaching the end point of a cycle. So we see that this person is covered in swords. Perhaps they were murdered, killed by their own toxic thoughts. Maybe their toxic thoughts came to an inevitable end because it was no longer serving them. Maybe it's related to a belief system or a sense of self. That's how I usually relate back when it comes to this card. So, with that said, what are some other things that we've been taking from this card, or can take from this card, instead of it just being an ego death or a death that is suffering, which yes, perhaps you're using this card to explain some level of suffering. Maybe there is a very traumatic end that's taking place for you. But this, I really feel like, and Holly Simple's card relates this really easily or very deeply for me. We see the third eye and we see the swords in the head and in the eye. Again, talking about mental capacities, maybe more so than our physicality, and relating back to our spiritual self. Now, Holly Simple's deck has this little quickie card review thing, and I actually want to do a review on this deck because I do think it's a good indie tarot deck to look into. The card in here displays, different words to associate with different cards. And of course, the word for this card is crisis. Now, I don't actually relate this to crisis necessarily a whole lot, because to me, yes, it might feel like crisis, but in ego deaths, we actually have more of a release and a fresh start, right? It's at an end. It cannot hurt you anymore. And that's actually a really good relief. It's a good release to have that as like, oh, don't worry. It's okay that maybe you can't see yourself in this way because maybe it didn't fully support your growth. Maybe you can't see others in a certain way because they didn't support you fully in your growth. And lastly, maybe something didn't work out because it wasn't for your best interests, or maybe it wasn't going to go the way you wanted it, so it had to end the way it did. Or let's say there's a belief system that needs to die. And that, I think, is the best thing. So when we think about Gemini, I like to refer it back to the card that is related to Gemini, the Lovers. So if you are kind of interested to see what is this Gemini energy maybe about, I do have a video in the links down below to kind of explain what Gemini is, unpacking Gemini. But a lot of the magic around Gemini, when we're looking at it in the tarot through the Lovers, is the fact that we see people as our mirrors. It's not necessarily we are in love with someone, but we see them as a reflection of either good or bad qualities that we see in ourselves. So perhaps a certain cycle has to die. Maybe even a friendship that you really supported or really valued has come to an end because either they have felt that you don't resonate with them, or you have grown out of their view of you. So there's a lot to unpack when it comes to final countdowns in our world of astrology and tarot, right? The truth is, and I say this a million times and I'll say it again and again, tarot and no card is good or bad. It's either how we interpret it or how we experience it. So even though something might be very uncomfortable, we might be going through an intense death, it's actually for our highest good. We cannot reach the finish line by bypassing that which is uncomfortable. That includes conversations, that includes having the reality of stepping into, yes, this is no longer serving me. And that goes with ideologies, that goes with friends, family, connections. And I feel like that relates back to our full moon energy, because with this illumination later in the month and it being eclipses, we are going to see people as they are fully illuminated. Whether that's good or bad as how we perceive them, we're going to have to reconcile with realities that connect back to those that we love or structures that we have felt comfortable in. And of course, structures are built by people, right? Our structures in the world are built by others. So if you're really interested to see how this Ten of Swords maybe relates to you in my big cosmic reading, keep an eye out for that. It's going to be released on the 17th. Of course, there's no Ten of Swords actually in that reading, but regardless, I feel like Ten of Swords was a card that I wanted to dive into because it's another spooky card that's really not that spooky. So with that said, I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. Happy new moon if you see this when I put it up, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.